Greywick Tower stood on the edge of a western coastline, where the land ended abruptly and the sea began without mercy. It was an old structure, built from dark stone, tall and narrow, rising above the cliffs like a monument that had forgotten its purpose. The wind struck it constantly. Salt ate into its surface. Even in daylight, the tower looked dim, as if it absorbed the sky rather than reflected it. The people in the nearest town rarely said its name aloud. When they did, they used a different one. They called it the Listener. A journalist came to Greywick Tower in the late afternoon, carrying a backpack and a recorder. The trip had been planned for an article, an old tower, a local legend, and a caretaker living alone above the sea. It was the kind of story that could be written in a day and published within a week. The journalist told themselves it was only work, but the truth was simpler. They had not been sleeping. Their mind had been filled with the same memory for years, repeating itself with a precision that never softened. Greywick Tower seemed like a place that matched that kind of repetition. At the wooden gate on the cliff path, the caretaker was already waiting. His name was Elias Wren. He held a ring of iron keys in his hand. His coat was old, and his hair looked permanently dusted with gray. He did not greet the journalist. He only watched them approach, as if he had been expecting them for longer than a day. "You're late," Elias said. The journalist checked the time. They were not late. "I'm on time," they answered. Elias paused. Then he spoke again, calmly. "No one is on time for Greywick." He unlocked the gate and allowed the journalist through. When he closed it behind them, the sound carried farther than it should have. It did not feel like a gate closing. It felt like a boundary being confirmed. The path climbed along the cliffs. Below, the sea moved violently against the rocks. Above, gulls drifted in wide circles, occasionally crying into the wind. Greywick Tower grew larger with every step. It did not look abandoned. It looked maintained, yet untouched by comfort. At the entrance, Elias placed a hand on the door and pushed. The hinges groaned. The interior air was cold and damp, unlike the air outside. It had the texture of stone that had held water for a long time. Candles lined the lower chamber, their flames steady in a draft that could be felt at ankle height. The lower chamber was circular. It contained a small table, scattered journals, a chipped cup, and a brass bell placed carefully at the center. The journalist looked at the bell. "What is that for?" they asked. Elias did not touch it. "It reminds the tower that I'm here," he said. Then he added, without emphasis, "And it reminds me that I'm not." Elias began to explain the tower's history. His voice remained even, as if the story had been repeated too many times to feel new. Greywick had been built centuries ago as a watchtower. It once existed to warn ships about storms and reefs. Lantern signals had been used, then abandoned. The tower should have become irrelevant. Instead, over time, it became a place people visited for other reasons. The coastline took lives regularly. Ships broke apart. Men disappeared. Families buried what they could recover. At some point, people began to look for a way to hear the dead again. They carved symbols into the tower's inner walls. They brought offerings and names. They asked for answers. They asked for forgiveness. They asked for the kind of relief that could not be bought anywhere else. The journalist tried to label it as folklore, But Elias did not argue. He only used a single word to describe why it happened. Desperation, he said. He guided the journalist up the spiral stairs. The steps wrapped around the inside of the tower in a tight curve. The higher they went, the more the air changed. It became sharper and heavier, as if the tower held its own pressure. On the second level, narrow windows cut into the stone showed the sea. The view looked too close. The horizon seemed unstable. It gave the impression that the outside world had shifted while the tower remained fixed. At the third level, the walls were covered in names carved into stone, hundreds of them, perhaps more. Some were neat, some were scratched deeply and unevenly, as though carved by shaking hands. The journalist asked about the names. Requests, Elias said. Requests for forgiveness, requests to be remembered, requests to be released. He said it plainly, without romance. At the next level, Elias stopped before an iron door and unlocked it. Inside was a narrow room, a bed, a desk, a candle, and an old book bound in cracked leather. "This is where you'll sleep," Elias said. The journalist assumed they would stay only one day. Elias corrected them. "You're here for a night." The journalist pointed at the book on the desk. "What's that?" Elias stayed in the doorway and did not enter. "The register," he said. "People who came here, people who left." The journalist asked if the register also contained the names of people who never left. Elias answered evenly. "The tower keeps its own list." Then he left the room.
That night, the journalist did not sleep. The tower was not silent. The wind outside did not only howl. The sound came through narrow openings and returned as something that resembled whispering. The sea below struck the cliffs in a pattern that repeated without variation, like breath. Underneath everything, there was a faint tapping sound. It was not rhythmic. It was not mechanical. It sounded like fingertips against glass. At some point after midnight, the candle flame bent as if something had moved past it. The room remained empty. Then the journalist heard a voice. It was low, close, and unclear at first. It did not come through the door or the window. It felt as if it rose through the stone itself. The voice repeated a short sentence. "You left me." The journalist sat up immediately. The words were not unfamiliar. They matched the sound of someone the journalist had once known very well. Their brother. 2 years earlier, there had been a car accident. The brother had died. The journalist had survived. It was an accident that should not have created survivors at all, but it did. The journalist had been driving, and afterward there was a detail that never stopped returning, a truth that the journalist had never admitted in full. They had left the wreck before help arrived. Not for long, not forever, but long enough. The journalist had always called it panic. They had always framed it as an attempt to get help faster. It sounded acceptable when spoken aloud, but the memory did not agree with the explanation. The voice repeated again, "You left me." The journalist's breathing became shallow. The room remained still. No footsteps, no shadows.
Then, from below, the brass bell rang once. The sound was clean and sharp. It cut through the whisper like a warning. Immediately after the bell, the voice stopped. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt attentive. The journalist left the room and moved down the stairs with the candle. Their steps were careful, but there was no decision to stop. The tower felt like it had already chosen the direction for them. As the journalist descended, the carved names on the wall caught the candlelight in ways that made them appear slightly uneven, as if the stone had shifted around them. At the narrow windows, the sea looked closer than it had earlier, as if the waterline had climbed higher. When the journalist reached the lower chamber, Elias Wren was standing beside the table and the brass bell. He looked unsurprised. "It gets restless," he said. The journalist told him about the voice. Elias asked one question. "Who?" The journalist answered honestly, "My brother." Elias did not react with shock. He only acknowledged it. "It always starts with someone they miss," he said. The journalist asked if the tower was real. Elias answered without emotion, "Real enough to ruin a person." The journalist asked what it wanted. Elias looked briefly toward the center of the chamber, where the floor had a faint circular seam. "It wants to be heard," he said, "and it wants to be fed." The journalist asked what it fed on. Elias answered, "Regret." Elias then gave instructions. The journalist should leave in the morning. They should not go higher. They should not read the register. And if they heard the voice again, they should not answer. The journalist asked why. Elias explained that the tower used familiar voices because it knew those voices were the easiest bait. A person would trade almost anything for one more sentence spoken by the dead. The journalist noticed that Elias spoke from experience. Elias admitted he had answered once. The journalist assumed that was why he had stayed. Elias corrected them. He had not stayed because he had answered. He had stayed to prevent the tower from leaving. Elias walked away. The journalist remained in the lower chamber with the bell, the journals, and the register upstairs. The warning should have ended the night. It did not. The journalist went to the desk and opened the register. The pages contained names, dates, and notes. Some entries ended with the word left. Some ended with the word returned. Others ended with no conclusion. Near the back of the book, the journalist found their own name. Not only the first name, but the full legal name, written neatly. Beside it was a single note, "arrived." No date, no departure. The ink looked settled, not recent. The journalist turned pages quickly. The name remained in place, as if it had never been added, as if it belonged there. Then the bell rang once. No one touched it. The circular seam in the stone floor seemed to tighten. The air changed in temperature, dropping slightly. The journalist heard the whisper again. "You left me." But it was no longer their brother's voice. It was the journalist's voice. The journalist stepped backwards, holding the register tightly. The candles flickered without wind. The seam in the floor began to move. Stone ground against stone. A round opening formed slowly, like a lid being lifted. Elias returned to the chamber immediately, moving faster than before. His expression was controlled, but the tension in his face indicated that something had become irreversible. He asked what the journalist had done. The journalist said they had only looked. Elias told the journalist they could still leave, but only if they stopped wanting answers. The journalist did not understand the instruction. Elias pressed the brass bell into the journalist's hands and told them to ring it. The journalist rang the bell. The sound spread through the tower. The seam in the floor stopped widening. The whisper quieted. Elias then gave one final instruction. "Tell it the truth," he said. The journalist understood what he meant. The tower did not require facts. It required confession. It wanted ownership. The whisper returned. "You left me." The journalist spoke. They admitted they had left the wreck. They admitted they had been afraid. They admitted that even though their brother was still alive for some time after the crash, they had walked away. As the confession finished, the tower became still. The seam in the floor sealed closed. The candle flames steadied. The air returned to the damp cold it had before. Everything looked normal again. The journalist believed briefly that relief had been achieved. Elias did not agree. He turned to a journal on the table and wrote the journalist's name. Then he wrote a new note beside it. Began duty. The journalist did not understand at first. Then they tried to leave. Elias told them the truth. The tower did not keep the ones who confessed. It released them. But the release was not freedom. The tower removed the pain. It emptied the guilt. It left the memory intact and stripped the suffering away. That should have sounded merciful. It was not. Because the absence of guilt did not create peace. It created a vacancy. And the tower filled that vacancy with something else. Something patient. Something hungry. Elias explained that the tower did not remain trapped in the cliffs. It traveled through people. Those who confessed became invitations. They would go back into the world and create interest, curiosity, and longing. They would describe Greywick Tower as a place where the dead could almost be reached. And people would come. The journalist insisted they did not want that. Elias said he had not wanted it either. Then he walked up the spiral stairs, his footsteps fading. He did not return. At sunrise, the journalist left Greywick Tower. The sky was pale. The sea was calmer, almost ordinary. The wind felt less aggressive. Nothing appeared supernatural. No voices followed them down the path. But something had changed. The journalist still remembered their brother's death clearly. They remembered the wreck, the noise, the smell, the moment of leaving. But the emotional pain was absent. There was no shaking, no nausea, no weight. The grief had not healed. It had been removed. That absence produced a different kind of emptiness. The journalist returned to town and wrote the article. The tower was described as mysterious, ancient, and unsettling. The caretaker was presented as a lonely figure living above the sea. The whispering was written as folklore. The hunger was not mentioned. The confession was not mentioned. The register was not mentioned. The article was published online. It spread quickly. People enjoyed the aesthetic. They admired the sadness. They treated it as an experience to visit. Many said they would go. The journalist read the comments without reacting. They felt no alarm. They felt no guilt. Only a quiet sense of completion. Weeks later, the journalist returned to the cliff path. They stood at the wooden gate. A ring of iron keys rested in their hand. The sea roared below. The wind pulled at their coat. A young visitor approached, carrying a backpack and a tense expression that suggested sleeplessness. The visitor asked if the journalist was the caretaker. The journalist opened the gate. "You're late," they said. The visitor apologized and said they needed to talk to someone. The journalist allowed them through. "No one is on time for Greywick," they said. The gate closed behind them. The tower remained above, silent and waiting. And inside the journalist's chest, something listened closely.